what's the location of your emergency?
I have no idea where I'm at. I am in the middle of nowhere. We were looking for Shantae Blankenship.
Okay.
We found her.
You okay? Does she need any medical attention?
Is she alive? She's dead.
This is where the Brown County Sheriff's Department found the body of Rhonda Shantae Blankenship on County Road 424. They're calling her death a homicide.
Blankenship died from a crushed larynx and blunt force injuries to her neck, face, and torso. Sheriff Vance Hill says some of those injuries were caused by a lawnmower blade found near her body.
Bryan County law enforcement arrested 21-year-old Ryan Riggs for capital murder. The break in the case came when the sheriff's office released a computerized sketch of Riggs using his DNA. Blankenship and Riggs went to the same church.
Pastor Keener says Riggs then went before the entire congregation and confessed to killing fellow church member Shantae Blankenship before turning himself in.
He said, I need to confess something. And in that confession, he said, I've done something real bad. I murdered her.
You good? You okay? Bottle of water? I'm gonna have one.
I just had one.
Okay. Sheriff just gave me a call a little while ago and said that you got something off your chest, and we're just gonna see if you tell us what you got off your chest.
I'm the one who murdered Shantae Blankenship.
When did this happen?
On Friday the 13th.
Okay. So this happened on Friday the 13th. Tell me about that day. How did you start that day out?
It was just like an average day to me up until I did what I did.
He says that he's killed Shantae, but there's no real emotion. There's nothing in his body language that suggests that he's experiencing any real stress. He's not shaking. He's not showing any outward or visible signs of stress. He's somewhat matter-of-fact about the whole thing. And those are some of the indications that start to suggest that there is a psychopathic presence.
Where did you find Shantae that day?
She was walking past the mailboxes in Tamarack Mountain. I stopped and asked her if she needed a ride. And she got in my truck, and I asked her if she was going home. She said no. I asked her if she wanted to hang out. She said yes. Whenever I saw her, it's like I've always had this different part of me that it just wants nothing but destruction and evil. And whenever I saw her that day, it took over. I knew what I was trying to get, or what it was trying to get. It wanted to kill somebody. It wanted to rape.
What is it? Your destructive side, is that what you're talking about?
The only thing I can think of what it might be is Satan.
Satan.
He's owning that he has strong impulses to do things that he's told he shouldn't do. He invokes Satan. It feels evil to him. It comes to him very naturally. And so that's what's interesting about him. He's aware of these feelings that he has, these urges that he has to do things that he knows aren't right, but it bothers him that it doesn't bother him.
Riggs slips up in this part of the interview and tells authorities some details about what had taken over in him. But when he switches tracks and refers to himself and his actions as it and identifies it as Satan, what I hear is somebody who actually thought through and contemplated what his story was going to be when he finally did confess to authorities, and he forgot. He had a moment where he forgot that he had planned to distance himself from his own actions, that it was something inside of him like a monster that did this, not himself. And that subtle switch where he says, I, and then switches to it is somewhat significant and more consistent with psychopathic behavior and not a misunderstood teenager.
When y'all were sitting in the truck talking, what are y'all talking about?
Music.
What y'all liked, or what was playing, or what?
Well, I had a sound system in my truck, so I was letting her go through all my music and stuff. And I was talking to her about the music that she liked and Every time she'd play a song, she'd say something like, "Oh, that's my song."
The way that Riggs hangs out with Shantae and describes that they're sitting in the car, they're flirting, they're listening to music.
There is an element of manipulation in this, that he is basically trying to pull her in and get her to feel comfortable. It is an effort to disarm her so that ultimately he'll have greater control and power over her.
I'm not sure what exactly I wanted. I just don't know how to describe it. I wanted both things to happen, the rape and the murder.
Did Friday the 13th play a role in this?
No, it's just, as soon as I seen her, it's just something that wasn't me came over me. We went down in there, and it's surrounded by trees, and we parked, and we were sitting in the truck for a while. And then, out of nowhere, I just put my left arm around her and began to strangle her. And whenever she had passed out, I took her clothes off and I raped her. And then afterwards, I went to that abandoned house on County Road 424. And I dragged her body out of my truck. Then I threw her over that fence, and then climbed over the fence and dragged her to that tank battery where I had put her. I went back to my truck and got a lawnmower blade out of the back of my truck. And I went back to where she was, and I beat her to death with it to make sure that she was dead.
Do you think she was dead before that?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Why do you not think so?
Because parts of her body were still moving and twitching.
Were her eyes open or closed?
Her eyes were open, but they were open the entire time.
What he chose to do was harm her, torture her, drag her off, and then bludgeon her. And all of those indications suggest somebody who's got paraphilic interests. Paraphilias are deviant sexual interests. What we're talking about is an individual who gets sexually aroused by creating harm and fear in their victims. The non-consensual component of that sexual activity is the point of arousal.
No. Did you use anything else hitting her besides the lawnmower blade?
I remember putting a knife to her throat, even though it wasn't sharp at all.
This is an example of his sadistic tendencies and desires. He is going above and beyond. At this point, she's presumably already dead, which is a very personal action to take and full of rage. So it's an enhanced level of sadism that he is getting some sort of pleasure out of being so violent with her.
The clothes you were wearing that night, what were you wearing?
I don't even remember. I know I was wearing shorts, that's for sure.
What'd you do with those clothes?
Probably just kept them. I didn't try to dispose of them or anything.
What kind of shoes were you wearing?
I was wearing some Jordans that I used to have.
Where are those shoes now?
In the garbage. I threw them away a long time ago.
So you kept them for a little while?
I kept them for a while.
How come you kept them?
I just thought that they were good shoes.
Riggs may have been keeping the shoes because functionally they were nice shoes, but more likely he kept them as a trophy. He kept them as a reminder of the crime and what he had done. And the dubious part about it is that they were hidden in plain sight. They were part of the weapons used in this crime that harmed her. And ultimately, nobody at that point suspected that he had anything to do with Shantae's disappearance, much less her rape and her murder. And to walk around with those shoes on for some time after she was killed and found really does start to speak to someone who was reliving it.
How did you know Shantae?
Well, she was widely known in that community, so everyone knows everyone out there. She went to church, the same church I went to. My parents would pick her up and give her rides sometimes. Sometimes I feel like that she liked me and she was always trying to flirt. I didn't want anything to do with that.
When you say she would flirt with you, what would she do?
She would just joke and just talk and laugh.
Right.
But I would just block her out, pretend she wasn't there.
His victim selection is really important to his MO. He's keeping it close to home. He very easily could have gone somewhere else to find a victim in a different community and then just come back. Part of targeting her is because her absence will be noted that's doing something for him. It calls to mind like the arsonist who goes to watch the fire in a way.
Reeks is someone that it's hard to know what his motivation was towards the negative feelings he had towards Shantae. But what does seem to emerge is this sense of jealousy. The community was protective of her. They made room for her. Reeks may have had some jealousy that he himself didn't feel protected or loved or wanted, that the community hadn't made such room for him and embraced him. And as a result, that may have been some hostility that played out during the crime as well.
Let's say this, like, how many times had you met her before or hung out?
Well, actually hanging out, probably just a handful of times, like 4 or 5 times. Whenever she just happened to be with the same people that I was with. Usually, we would just hang out like at the pool.
Through all that time, you knew she was a little bit mentally handicapped.
Yes.
Do you think that played a role in this for you?
I think whatever came over me knew that she was an easy target.
You think that's because she was a small girl or because she had the mental problems or both?
Individuals who are psychopaths purposely target the weaker and the more vulnerable because they can be easy targets. He viewed her as an easy target because of her size and her cognitive limitations. And it's an opportunity for him to take control, exact his will and desires, and not have to fight too hard for it.
Is it something you're thinking about doing, or is it just something when you woke up that morning that those thoughts came over you? Or?
Well, before I had seen Shantae walking, I had decided to go for a drive in my truck because sometimes I just like to drive around the community and blare loud music. And whenever I was driving and I had seen her, just immediately it was like something else had come over me.
So she just happened to be in the wrong spot? You think it's just you saw her and knew her and thought, this is somebody that'll work for this? Do you know?
It's like I didn't have any thought process at all. My eyes were watching me do what I was doing, but there was no thought behind it. Just one evil.
You said that you had seen her walking around before, right? Of course, she walks around there all the time. Before this day, had you ever seen her walking and go, one of these days? Or was it just a spur of the moment deal that night?
It was just on that moment. I had never had any type of thoughts like that about her.
Had you ever had those type of thoughts about anybody before?
Not anyone specific, but wanting to do that to a person, yes.
How long have you been having those thoughts before this happened?
I've always had these thoughts. It's always been like I've been living with a different part of me. Sometimes it's mean, sometimes it's something else that just wants evil and nastiness.
He's saying it's evil in me, but it's him. When he says nothing's going through his mind, I don't think that's actually how it's happening. I don't think he's lying, but I think he has a hard time kind of tapping into the part of his brain that feels just very natural doing these things that seem so unnatural to most people.
What made you decide to talk to her?
These past couple of days, and trying to figure out what it is that I need to do.
Now, about a week ago, when we started knocking on your door and stuff, we released a composite profile picture to the media. Did you see that?
Yeah.
What did you think when you saw that?
I remember thinking, I hope that no one sees this and tells them that they know someone who looks like that.
So Riggs' decision to confess was not because he was overcome by guilt. It's not because he was overcome by regret or remorse for what he had done to another human being. It's because he knew that he was going to be found. It may have been his attempt to remain in control of the narrative, which is, I'm a good person who did a bad thing, and I have all this remorse and regret.
I can't imagine what you've been going through for the past year and a half. The anxiety, you know, has it gotten to you pretty hard? Had you tried to kill yourself before?
Yes.
Yeah. Before this last week?
Yes. I've tried to kill myself on numerous occasions, before and after what I did to Shantae. So I've always known that there was another part of me that wasn't good.
Hard to say about his expression of suicidality, if he genuinely had been suicidal or if he's saying it in order to garner sympathy and perhaps impact the outcome of his case, or maybe it's a little bit of both. But his other actions and statements throughout this interview and in the records do not paint the picture of someone who is riddled with grief and remorse over his actions.
You said you hadn't done this to other people. Have you done it to other things like animals, livestock, anything like that?
We used to have a Chihuahua, and sometimes I would get the same feelings that I did whenever I saw Shantae. I tried on numerous occasions to drown that Chihuahua in a 5-gallon bucket of water. I would try to hold it there until it would stop kicking and struggling.
This is an early red flag for future violent behavior, even sadistic behavior. Individuals who hurt those that are more vulnerable to them, whether we're talking about an animal or a human being, are people who tend to be particularly callous and not have the same respect for humanity that the majority of society does. So this small animal was another easy victim for him.
But I would just hold it there long enough to where I would just think to myself, what am I doing? And then I'd make myself stop. But I never told anyone about that either.
You were arrested, 2012 for burglary? You remember that?
I remember I was arrested whenever I was 14, or I was arrested whenever I was 15. I was just always doing something.
What else? What other kind of stuff were you doing?
Mostly just drug abuse. Buying drugs, doing drugs, running around.
Were you selling drugs?
Sometimes if I needed a little bit extra money. I started smoking weed whenever I was 15 years old. I started using meth. First time I used meth, I was 19.
When we get into drug use and drug experimentation, we're in that novelty-seeking realm. One of the features with psychopathy can be just increased stimulation needs, that they need something new. They need something stimulating, exciting, and that can frequently be drugs. That could be a lot of other things, but we're seeing that in his own description.
There are a lot of people at church tonight. You were up there.
No, there wasn't that many people.
What was their reaction when you told them?
They all told me that I was doing the right thing. Went up to the front of the church and told everybody what I did.
I shouldn't be shocked that he did this, and we saw that troubled look in his eyes that's always been there until last Wednesday night. And he got mixed up in that experience out there at the Juvenile Detention Center. I don't know if it surfaced in y'all's records, but he stole a gun, and all of that mess. And that was right before his 16th birthday. You could just see where he was headed. That's what hurts me, is that why I didn't pick up on that way back in May of 2016 is thinking, what if Ryan did that?
None of us have a crystal ball.
But he's been a troubled child from day one. I have replayed that in my mind. I didn't get that. I mean, right there at the Surge that Sunday afternoon.
You tell me once that you knew temperature body or DNA, so you knew that once you started the fire, that no one ever probably will prove darkness, even though you did great twice. Right. You for sure. You didn't have to take a weapon in with you. So did you know there would be a weapon in there that you could use? Or did you plan on just strangling her to it? They just said they had nothing, no holes on. I felt capable of going
authority that gives Barnes is significant. He is now going to not only get to relive the crime and the violence that he inflicted on his wife, but he's going to get to see the emotional reaction and trauma that it causes on her ex-husband.
Okay. We contacted Mr. Birdie. He has agreed to come to the Sheriff's Office substation and is present here in the room with us now. Mr. Barnes, this is a request that you made, is that correct? Yes, it is. Got released from prison October 31st of this year. I went back to drug use. December 11th. Some coffee, a paper. Found some drugs in the house, some crack cocaine. Must have put it there prior.
He's clearly denying and minimizing and not taking responsibility and doing what a lot of drug abusers do, but also psychopaths do, blame it on something else. It's not me, it's the alcohol. And he's kind of doing the same thing. It's sort of the same script.
Got really upset. The tears. You locked the bedroom door on me, don't get out of the house. She started hitting me or knee me or something. I stepped under, got behind her, and grabbed her around the neck. And we went to the floor hard. Okay. Yeah. She went face first. I held on. I saw blood. I picked her up off her feet. I don't know how she did it. She got a hold of the wall. And it took me out balance.
Barnes is trying to paint this as a simple lover's quarrel or marital disagreement when in fact there's broken doors, there's holes in the wall, there are door frames that have been removed by somebody grabbing them and kicking them in. This is not a situation of two people who had a misunderstanding that spun out of control. The intense displays of emotion that you hear in Barnes and his account are superficial at best. They're insincere, they turn on and off like a faucet of waterworks, and ultimately they're not consistent with how people display real emotions. What they are is highly consistent with how a psychopathic individual views emotions and what they think people want to hear and see. It's not uncommon when we have these types of displays of emotion that if you actually look closely, there's no tears. And we don't have a video of this point in the interview, we have an audio, but he reconstitutes pretty quickly and then immediately turns the emotions back on where he's out of control and can't even get the words out. And emotions just don't work they don't work like an on-off switch, they work like a dimmer switch. And psychopaths have a difficult time understanding that subtle reality because again, they are mimicking what they think people experience, but because they don't experience those emotions and they don't feel them internally, they're guessing.
And you're still in your mind, or we hit so hard on the floor. Her head first, we went down.
He never owns responsibility for killing her. It's a distanced description. She need him, he thinks. He pushed her down. It was hard. He doesn't know how it really happened, but she went face first. If you think of it like a painting, you're getting a very broad brushstroke of something about the scene, but you can't fill in the detail.
When I left it on the floor, she was squirming, trying to get away. You still trying to hold her? I was holding. I didn't want her to fight me no more. I didn't want her to fight back. I held on until I knew she could fight me anymore. Lynn died. What you do while you're home? I thought I could make things okay. I just started cleaning up, doing dishes. Okay, so what did you do? Stay with it. Did you do anything to hide the fact that you were responsible for that? For what? For her death? No. Let me tell you something. In the recycle bins outside, why did you take the trash in the road? It's not a nice trash thing. Why do you care about the trash when your wife's dead in the house? I figured if I just want to make it look normal. I was trying to act normal, so I stayed there all day.
The fact that Barnes continued to stay in their home for 2 days, knowing there was a dead body in the closet, and he took more care and attention to make sure that the trash was taken out, dishes were cleaned, that the home was otherwise orderly, really shows a disconnect. His feeble attempt at taking the trash out so that things look normal doesn't really compensate or equate to the loss of human life, but in his mind, they're somehow equal. They're equal gestures.
You realize what you did? You understand? Yeah. That's it. Believe it was wrong. I can't believe it happened. Everything's gone. Everything. Feels life. James, is that the extent of what you want to tell Tony? On tape that I just want you to know you never do anything wrong. I was sick. I was sick. She loved me very much. When it came to stupid, it was just, wait, hold on. If I had told you what I knew a long time ago, you would have known what to do.
Barnes could be alluding to the fact that he knows more than they know. It's clear that he's saying, if you had known about what I was going to do earlier, maybe you could have done something about it. So it's a way of blaming the ex-husband as well. So he still doesn't have responsibility in his mind for what he did.
Thus concluding the interview, so switch to side B. Interview's concluded.
Barnes would have us believe this was just a domestic dispute, but we know that that's not the case. He had killed before.
Knock, knock. Come in. Hello. 514. Well, good for you. You been in confinement? Yeah. She moved tall. She went through death rows. What's that? That's body description's bad. Couldn't catch breath or what. They didn't transfer me over here. They're pulling us down. No. Yeah. No. Oh, okay. He's fine. He's just doing the audio. No problem. Are we on video right now? Yes. I've known you for a little more than 4 months, and I trust you. I'm talking about a matter that happened in August 1988. There are no questions you could ever ask me that I would not answer.
This is once again Barnes taking control of a situation. You see his psychopathic side really take the lead. He is narcissistic, he's arrogant, and he really understands that there is a power that he has in this situation because law enforcement wants to understand what this cold case was about.
We talked before about the incident happened in 1988. You never was clear on her name. You said you read it in the newspaper or something.
Yeah, I know. I did to this day. And I swear by Allah, I really don't know her. I know I've been told this several times, but I believe in it all the time.
She was Patricia Miller. She was a nurse who lived in a complex near him. It's another reflection of this complete, really, indifference to personal identity. People aren't individuals to a man like Barnes. They're things. And so you can care enough to kill somebody, but they're not really important to remember as individual people.
Sometime in April of 1988, I entered north window of condominium unit. I believe it was River Oaks condominium off Roosevelt Avenue in Florida. I proceeded through the condominium, got a knife out of the kitchen. I caught Ava that we were in about Barbara in her bathroom, and I took her in the bedroom. I raped her. I got some shoestrings out of tennis shoes, went back in the bedroom, I tied her hands behind her back. I raped her again. I had her shoot up. I tried to start her to death. It didn't happen, and I ended up being death with a hammer back to the head.
There's a lot of sadism. He enjoyed humiliating her. He enjoyed hurting her physically. He enjoyed frightening her. And it was a prolonged several hours before he finally killed her. And he killed in a very personal, frightening way where she was probably experiencing her own death. So intense rage and a deep desire for destruction of the other person.
I went through her condominium. I took a bank card and took out the wallet. I can't remember if I took the wallet around it or not. I put all the items all I had touched inside the rucksack. I went outside as I had entered naked. I got off the got a lighter and cigarette, came back in through the front door and set it on fire. And then I got dressed real quickly and I left. I didn't believe I locked the front door as I went out. And that's what I did.
Despite the fact that almost 17 years have gone by from when he committed this violent murder, and when he's talking about it during this interview with INSCO, he remembers things in a level of detail about taking a bank card, putting things in a rucksack, where he exited the house, whether he left the door locked or unlocked. Barnes has been reliving this crime in his mind, getting a euphoria or a high off of it all these years.
What makes you think about getting naked before you went in there? How did you get the window? You said it was a security system.
Well, I don't know if there was an alarm system or anything. I had a good chance that there was. I had slid my ID to lock a little bit, cash, and just slid right over. The reason why I got dressed before I went in was I didn't want to carry any material into that place. Now, my intent when I was secure.
So your intent was the record?
Not my intent was secure.
The decision that Barnes made to enter the victim's apartment nude suggests that he had a clear intent to sexually assault her. This is a calculated, cold act. This is somebody who doesn't have any attachment to the victim. It was about his own sexual gratification, his own power and control, and his need to kill.
What was on the video? Did you call fire? Was it a sheet, a comforter or something?
I believe it was a comforter on the north end of the middle of the bed.
About temperature, body, or DNA DNA, so you knew that once you started the fire, no one ever probably would prove the dumbness you know you didn't break the laws. Right. You for sure. You didn't have to take a weapon in with you. So did you know there would be a weapon in there that you used, or did you plan on just strangling it? You said you had nothing to propose on. I felt it was all the line. Doing what I wanted to do.
Part of the control dynamic is in planning the hunt, right? Planning the action. They've had a fantasy in their head about how it should proceed and go, the stages that the act will occur in, and they mentally rehearse it.
When did you decide to kill her? I'm not bringing me up before you, but you mentioned that she humiliated you before, and no, that.
You know, I did. I killed her, and I made that decision. But I think it would be very best if I didn't mention our encounter and how I felt when she said it, because I don't want to diminish, anybody. I don't want to put anybody on the best. I did what I did, and I did. I'm just not really want to answer that.
This is where we see truly the presentation of a psychopathic personality. He does not owe anyone anything, and as long as he maintains control of the interview, he's good to go. But the minute they start asking him about things that he looks bad or somehow diminish his status and his sense of authority and compromise his ego and his self-esteem, he won't go there. So despite claiming that he would say to Insco, "I'll answer anything," he's clearly not willing to.
Why did you decide to kill her?
That's one of those questions.
He doesn't want to talk probably about rejection, about being humiliated. He clearly remembers what she said 17 years ago, and it makes him feel so small and squeamish that he's able to talk about killing her, but he can't talk about how rejection made him feel, because it made him feel like nothing. It made him feel so bad. And because that moment is so difficult for him, so humiliating, he rewrites the story to say that I'm actually protecting her reputation.
And why was it so important for you to try to help me out?
It seemed like that I've been haunted. There's the right way and wrong way to do everything. The right way. You think that I'm not a real person because I hide stuff like this. I'll do that once in a while. And that's exactly what I do.
This is another example of the control and the appearance of something being perhaps socially appropriate. Barnes is almost saying, I have a spiritual advisor, I'm a spiritual person, think of me in this way, but he's not. We don't see any signs of contriteness or remorse. It still is all about him rather than the victims themselves.
But I'll tell you something. You know the saying, I'm all in. Yes. I'm all in anyway. And there's a couple of matters that I will resolve with you. But not today. Not today.
The call came in just before dawn. The kind that cracks the night clean in half. The kind that leaves a house standing open and a life suddenly unfinished. And even now, decades later, people in this town still remember the way the fog hung low over the street that morning, thick and silent. As if it knew something everyone else was about to learn the hard way, because on that quiet California block in the spring of 1995, a front door stood ajar. A car sat cooling in the driveway, and inside, a story began that would refuse to end. They found her on the kitchen floor, barefoot, one sock still on, the radio humming a local news station, the voice cheerful and unaware, and there was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture screaming struggle, just a single cup on the counter, coffee gone cold. And a smear of blood that looked less like chaos and more like interruption, as if someone had walked into the middle of her life and pressed pause without warning. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering names, asking the same question again and again. Who would do this here, on this street, to someone like her? And the word that began to spread before noon was one that would haunt every headline after it: mystery. She was 29, recently promoted, recently engaged, the kind of person local papers described with words like bright and dependable, a woman whose routine was as predictable as the morning traffic, and that routine was now the first thing detectives tore apart, minute by minute, step by step. Retracing her last known movements through grocery store receipts, voicemail timestamps, and the memory of a coworker who swore she'd sounded distracted the day before, like she was waiting for something she didn't want to name. The house yielded little, fingerprints smudged beyond clarity, fibers that matched half the neighborhood, and a partial footprint near the back door that led nowhere, fading into the dirt like a thought no one could finish. By the end of the week, the media vans arrived, satellite dishes blooming on sidewalks, reporters talking about a peaceful community shattered, about fear creeping behind locked doors, and about a California 1995 cold case already taking shape in real time, because without a suspect, without a weapon, without a clear motive, the story began to slip, slowly at first, then all at once, from breaking news into something darker, something unresolved. Tips flooded the hotline, hundreds of them, strangers calling in with theories stitched together from coincidence and suspicion, an ex-boyfriend who lived 2 towns over, a delivery driver who couldn't remember his route, a shadow seen near the alley at dusk. And each lead flared briefly before burning out, leaving investigators with binders full of dead ends and a family staring at the same unanswered questions night after night. Detectives worked the case hard in those early months, fueled by urgency and pressure, knocking on doors until knuckles split, re-interviewing witnesses until stories blurred, chasing a timeline that refused to stay still, because everyone remembered something different once fear set in. Once the idea took hold that if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. They reconstructed her final evening, the drive home, the phone call she never returned, the car parked just a little crooked, and they wondered whether she knew her attacker, whether she'd opened the door willingly, whether trust had been the fatal miscalculation, but the house kept its secrets, offering no confession, no clear narrative, just silence. Then came the first strange detail, the one that would echo through the investigation for years, a trace of biological evidence recovered from beneath her fingernails, so small it barely registered at the time, cataloged, sealed, and stored away in a system not yet ready to understand its own future, because in 1995, DNA was still a promise more than a weapon, a developing science that sounded impressive in courtrooms but often failed in practice, and when the lab results came back inconclusive, the file was closed with a note that read like an apology. The case slowed. The headlines shrank. The cameras moved on. Time passed the way it always does in unsolved cases, not cleanly, not evenly, but in jagged leaps, anniversaries marked by brief mentions in the local paper, candlelight vigils attended by fewer people each year, detectives reassigned, promoted, retired, and the file itself growing heavier as it gathered dust, its edges softened by handling, its contents frozen in a version of the world that no longer existed. New families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the history under their feet. Children rode bikes past the house without knowing why older residents still glanced at it too long, and the phrase cold case began to settle over the story like a final verdict. But cold doesn't mean dead. It means waiting. Somewhere in a climate-controlled room, evidence sat in boxes, silent witnesses to a crime that refused to age gracefully, and every so often, a new detective would open the file, read through the reports, feel that familiar flicker of frustration, and then close it again. Because without something new, without a spark, the past remained stubbornly out of reach. The family never stopped pushing, never stopped calling, never stopped asking whether technology had caught up yet, whether there was anything else that could be done, and each time the answer hovered between hope and resignation. In the late 90s, a suspect briefly emerged, a man with a history of violence who'd been seen nearby. His name floated in the press, His face flashed on the evening news, and for a moment, it felt like the story might finally turn, but his alibi held, thin but intact. And the charges evaporated as quickly as they'd formed, leaving behind only more doubt and a community reminded of how easily certainty can slip through your fingers. Another lead followed years later, a jailhouse informant claiming knowledge in exchange for leniency, a familiar tune in the long soundtrack of unsolved crime, and once again, investigators chased shadows, only to find themselves standing in the same place, staring at the same walls. As the years stacked up, the case became a reference point, invoked whenever another crime rattled the area, a cautionary tale about randomness and vulnerability, and for younger officers, it was a kind of legend, a file everyone knew about but no one expected to solve. A reminder that some questions simply outlive the people who first asked them. Advances in forensic science marched on regardless. Databases expanded, techniques refined, and quietly, almost without fanfare, the possibility of re-examining old evidence crept back into conversations, tentative at first, then insistent. It started with a review, routine on paper, extraordinary in consequence, a cold case unit flipping through files with fresh eyes, flagging items that hadn't existed the last time this story was told, and there it was again, the biological trace from under her fingernails, preserved untouched, waiting for a world that finally knew how to listen. The decision to retest it wasn't dramatic, no flashing lights or urgent meetings, just a checkbox on a form, a sample sent to a lab equipped with tools that would have sounded like science fiction in 1995, and even then, no one allowed themselves to hope too loudly. Because hope had burned them before. While the lab worked, life continued on the surface, oblivious, and that's the part that still unsettles people the most. The idea that answers can exist in parallel with ignorance, that the truth can sit quietly in a database while the world spins on, unaware that a story long considered finished is about to crack open again. The investigators waited, the family waited, and somewhere in the space between past and present, a name hovered just out of reach, unknown but not unrecorded, embedded in genetic code that had survived longer than memory. This is how cold cases change. Not with sirens, not with confessions shouted across interrogation rooms, but with an email, a printout, result that doesn't explain itself, that doesn't offer context or motive, just a match percentage, and a line of data that forces everyone to sit down and breathe. Because suddenly, the unspeakable becomes measurable, and the question shifts from who did this to how no one knew for so long. And as the first confirmation arrived, cautious and electrifying all at once, the case that had slept for decades stirred, unaware that its next chapter would not just shock investigators, but reopen wounds a community had never fully allowed to heal. The notification arrived without ceremony, a sterile line of text on a screen in a quiet office, but the impact was seismic because the numbers didn't just align, they locked into place with a confidence that made seasoned investigators go still, the kind of stillness that follows a loud truth. And for the first time since 1995, the California cold case had a pulse, a genetic profile pulled from beneath her fingernails, now pointing toward a single individual buried deep inside a national database, a name no one in that room recognized, a man who had never been interviewed, never been a suspect, never appeared in any report, and yet there he was, suddenly impossible to ignore. They read it again, slower this time, checking margins, rerunning the comparison, calling the lab to confirm what they already feared and hoped in equal measure, because false positives had ruined careers and reopened wounds before, but the science held, clean and unyielding. And when the lab director finally said the words match confirmed, the room exhaled as one, knowing that everything that came next would be heavier, louder, and far more dangerous than the quiet decades that preceded it. The name belonged to a man who had been 22 in 1995, a drifter by most definitions, working short-term jobs, leaving little behind but payroll stubs and half-remembered impressions, and the deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Because he had lived less than 3 miles from the victim at the time, a detail that felt less like coincidence and more like accusation, and yet he had never crossed paths with investigators, never been flagged by tips. never surfaced in the chaos of those early months when everyone was scrutinized and no one felt safe. Records painted a fragmented portrait. Minor arrests years later for offenses that barely made headlines, a move out of state in the late 90s, then another. A life lived just far enough from the spotlight to avoid scrutiny, and that's what made it sting. The idea that while a family mourned and a community locked its doors, the person connected to the crime by DNA walked freely through a world that had forgotten him entirely. Investigators mapped his movements backward, reconstructing a timeline that now ran parallel to the victim's final days, and suddenly, places overlapped, streets intersected, routines brushed past one another in ways that felt unbearably intimate. They learned he'd once worked a temporary job near her office, that he'd been terminated weeks before the murder, that co-workers remembered him as quiet, unremarkable, a man who blended into the background so completely that even now, decades later, descriptions slid off him like rain. And this anonymity became its own kind of horror because monsters, it turned out, didn't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just clocked in, clocked out, and disappeared. Before any move could be made, the cold case unit slowed everything down because urgency was the enemy of precision, and after 30 years of waiting, no one wanted to be the one who rushed and broke it at the finish line. They subpoenaed old employment records, rechecked archived phone logs, tracked down witnesses who had long since assumed their relevance had expired, and each conversation carried the weight of resurrection, people startled by calls that dragged them back to a time they had carefully sealed off. A time when fear was fresh and the nights felt longer. One former neighbor remembered a man standing near the alley behind the victim's house in the weeks before the murder, smoking, watching, not doing anything overtly wrong, just lingering in a way that now made her skin crawl, but at the time, it had barely registered. Just another face in a neighborhood full of strangers, and that memory, half-formed and fragile, suddenly snapped into focus under the harsh light of DNA certainty. Another witness recalled a brief interaction at a local convenience store, a woman matching the victim's description, a man asking for directions. Nothing more, nothing less, and yet the date matched, the location matched. And investigators felt the case tightening around a truth that had been loose for far too long. As the picture sharpened, so did the ethical weight, because solving a cold case isn't just about catching someone, it's about disturbing a present that has grown comfortable with the past unresolved, and detectives knew that once they moved, there would be no quiet way back. They coordinated with authorities in the state where the suspect now lived, careful not to tip their hand, careful not to spook a man who had spent his adult life evading attention by accident or design, and when surveillance began, what they saw was almost banal. A modest home, a steady job, a routine as predictable as the one the victim once had, a reminder that evil doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like stability. The first knock on his door didn't come with sirens, just two plainclothes officers and a practiced comm, and when he answered, he didn't run, didn't shout, didn't slam the door. He listened, nodded, agreed to talk, and in that moment, the weight of 3 decades pressed into a single exchange. Because everything that followed would ripple backward through time. In the interview room, his posture stayed relaxed, his answers clipped but cooperative, and when they asked where he'd been in 1995, his brow furrowed, the past apparently inconvenient, fuzzy, something he hadn't rehearsed because he'd never expected to need it. They didn't mention DNA at first, didn't mention the victim. They let silence do the work, and in that silence, something shifted, a flicker of recognition or fear or calculation. No one could quite say, but it was enough to confirm that this wasn't just a name on a screen anymore. This was a human being with a history now colliding with evidence that didn't care about his version of events. When they finally laid out the science, the genetic match, the probability so high it bordered on inevitability, his composure cracked, not dramatically, not with tears or rage, but with a subtle withdrawal, shoulders pulling inward, eyes losing their focus. A man realizing that the past had finally caught up. He denied involvement, of course, claimed he'd never met her, never been inside her house, never hurt anyone, and in another era, without DNA, those words might have been enough to stall everything again, but this was no longer a he-said-she-said mystery. This was data. And data had a way of stripping lies down to their bones. Investigators pressed gently but relentlessly, pointing out inconsistencies, reminding him of places he'd been, people he'd worked with, the proximity he couldn't explain away, and still he held, a wall built from decades of distance. Charges were filed carefully, deliberately, each document a small explosion waiting to go public, and when the arrest finally came, it did so quietly, without spectacle, a man taken into custody at the end of an ordinary day, the irony almost cruel, because for the victim's family, no day since 1995 had ever been ordinary again. News broke hours later, a headline flashing across screens, California 1995 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough stuns investigators, and the community that had learned to live with uncertainty found itself reeling from certainty instead. The reaction was immediate and fractured, relief colliding with grief, vindication tangled up with rage, because while answers are powerful, they don't rewind time, they don't return what was stolen. And for some, the knowledge that the suspect had lived freely for so long felt like a second injustice layered on top of the first. Candlelight vigils returned to the street, this time with cameras and microphones, family members speaking through tears about justice delayed but not denied, while others struggled to reconcile the idea that the mystery they'd carried for decades now had a face, a name, and a legal future. In court filings, prosecutors laid out the DNA evidence with precision, explaining how technology had evolved, how a trace once dismissed as inconclusive now spoke louder than any eyewitness ever could, and experts prepared to testify not just about the match, but about the years it had taken for science to catch up with the crime, a timeline that forced everyone to confront the limits of justice and the patience it demands. The defense pushed back, questioned collection methods from the 90s, challenged chain of custody, argued contamination, because that's what you do when the facts are immovable. You attack the ground beneath them, and the battle lines formed slowly, deliberately, under the gaze of a public hungry for closure. But even as the legal process ground forward, something else shifted beneath the surface, a collective reckoning with the idea that answers can come too late to feel like victory, that solving a cold case doesn't end the story, it transforms it, turning mystery into memory, speculation into record, and forcing everyone involved to revisit a pain they'd learned to carry quietly. And as the trial loomed and the headlines multiplied, one truth settled in with uncomfortable clarity. The DNA may have spoken at last, but the echo of what happened in that kitchen in 1995 would never fully fade, because some questions, once answered, only deepen the silence they were meant to fill. The courtroom felt smaller than it should have, air thick with expectation and old grief, because this wasn't just a trial unfolding, it was time itself being dragged to the stand. Every year since 1995 compressed into wooden benches and muted murmurs, and as the defendant was led in, older now, grayer, heavier with the quiet weight of consequences postponed, eyes flicked toward the gallery where faces he had never seen carried a pain he had lived beside without touching for decades. The judge called the room to order, but order had never really returned to this case, not since the morning that door was found open and nothing made sense anymore. Prosecutors began with the science, because that was the spine of everything now, the thread that stitched past to present without mercy, and they spoke carefully, knowing that juries fear what they don't understand, explaining how a few skin cells trapped beneath fingernails had survived heat, moisture, storage, neglect, how they had waded through administrations and budget cuts and technological revolutions to finally be heard, and when the expert witness described the probability of the match, numbers so vast they bordered on abstraction, the room shifted, because abstraction was no longer possible. This was real. This was him. The defense rose with practiced confidence, challenging methods, pointing to gaps, reminding everyone that evidence collected in 1995 lived in a different world, a world of paper logs and manual handling, and for a moment, doubt flickered, because doubt always does when the stakes are this high. And that flicker was enough to remind the family that nothing was guaranteed, that even now, with DNA on their side, justice could still slip, just as it had so many times before. They questioned technicians, probed memory, suggested contamination with a calm that felt surgical, and the jury listened, aware that certainty is fragile, easily fractured by the right question. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, feeding a public appetite that had been starved for resolution, reporters repeating the phrase "cold case" like a mantra, reminding viewers how rare it was for a story like this to resurface with answers instead of apologies. And yet, beneath the headlines, unease lingered, because solving something so old forces a confrontation with everything that was missed, every chance that might have existed to stop it sooner. Former detectives were interviewed, voices older, regret threaded through professionalism, admitting that if the tools had existed then, things might have been different, that justice had been delayed not by indifference, but by limitation. A distinction that brought little comfort to those who had waited. As testimony continued, the victim's life was reconstructed in fragments, photographs projected onto screens, descriptions of routines, habits, dreams interrupted, and for jurors, this was perhaps the hardest part, because it transformed a file into a person, a laugh into a statistic. And when friends spoke about who she was before she became evidence, the room felt the full weight of what had been taken, not just a life, but decades of possibility. The defendant stared forward, expression carefully neutral, and no one could tell whether he was detached, defiant, or simply exhausted by the gravity of being finally known. Then came the timeline, prosecutors laying out movements and proximity, maps lighting up with points that edged closer and closer until coincidence collapsed under its own weight, and as locations overlapped, the narrative tightened, suggesting opportunity without yet revealing motive. Because motive, like so much else in this case, remained stubbornly unclear. The defense seized on that absence, arguing that DNA alone could not tell a story, could not explain why, could not bridge the gap between presence and action, and that argument landed, because humans crave reasons as much as they crave answers, and here, reasons were still in short supply. Behind the scenes, investigators revisited the past with new urgency, chasing threads they'd once abandoned, interviewing people who had grown old assuming their relevance had expired, and in those conversations, more details surfaced, small, unsettling. A co-worker recalling inappropriate comments dismissed at the time as awkwardness, a neighbor remembering footsteps late at night, sounds that had blended into the background noise of life until hindsight sharpened them into warnings. Each new detail didn't rewrite the story, but it deepened it, adding texture to a crime that had long been flat and unknowable. The defendant's past was scrutinized next, not to sensationalize but to contextualize, a pattern of instability, brushes with authority, nothing dramatic enough to predict murder, but enough to suggest a life lived on the margins of accountability, and prosecutors were careful here. Knowing the danger of turning character into destiny, of letting inference replace proof. They focused instead on access, on opportunity, on the undeniable fact that his DNA had no innocent explanation inside that house, and as that fact settled, it pressed down on the proceedings like gravity. Days blurred together, testimonies stacking up like sediment, and for the family, each day was a return to a place they had never truly left, every detail reopening wounds that had scarred but never healed, and yet there was resolve now, a sense that whatever the outcome, the truth had finally been dragged into the light. Community members packed the courtroom, some out of support, others out of a need to witness closure, to see with their own eyes that the story which had haunted their town for decades was no longer just rumor and memory. When closing arguments approached, tension spiked, because this was the moment where narrative crystallized, where both sides would attempt to imprint their version of events onto the jury's collective mind. The prosecution spoke of patience, of science, of the long arc of justice bending slowly but deliberately, urging jurors to trust the evidence even if it arrived late. The defense warned against hindsight, against the seductive certainty of modern tools applied to old wounds, reminding them that reasonable doubt doesn't expire with time, and when they finished, the room held its breath. Deliberations began behind closed doors, and outside, the waiting resumed, a familiar posture for those connected to the case, but this time, the waiting felt different, heavier, edged with finality, because whatever happened next would not be undone. News outlets speculated, experts debated, and the phrase cold case solved was repeated so often it began to sound fragile, as if saying it too loudly might shatter it. Inside the jury room, the weight of decades pressed against 12 people tasked with distilling a lifetime of loss into a verdict, and though no one could see it, arguments rose and fell, questions circled, doubts surfaced and were examined, because certainty, when it comes, is rarely instantaneous. Hours stretched, then days, and with each passing moment, the community hovered between past and future, suspended in a moment that felt both overdue and terrifying. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled to capacity, silence thick enough to taste, and as the foreperson stood, paper trembling slightly, everyone understood that this was more than a legal decision. It was a cultural one. A statement about whether time diminishes truth or simply delays it. The verdict itself would echo far beyond those walls, but even before it was read, one thing was already clear. The California 1995 cold case had transformed again, no longer just a mystery, no longer just a scientific triumph, but a mirror held up to a system, a community, and a generation forced to confront what it means when answers arrive decades late, carrying with them not relief alone, but a profound, unsettling reckoning that would not end when the gavel fell. The word guilty landed without drama, no cinematic gasp, no audible collapse, just a subtle intake of breath rippling through the room like a delayed reaction to an explosion, because after 30 years of waiting, certainty felt almost unreal, and for a moment, no one moved. As if motion itself might undo what had just been spoken. The defendant stared ahead, jaw tight, eyes fixed on a point beyond the wall, and whatever calculation he had carried for decades ended there, replaced by the blunt finality of a verdict that time could no longer protect him from. The family reacted in fragments, hands covering mouths, shoulders shaking silently, tears falling not in release but in accumulation, grief layered on grief, because a guilty verdict doesn't restore what was lost, it simply names the absence, and names, as it turns out, are heavy things to carry. Outside, reporters rushed to translate the moment into sound bites, into headlines that could fit on screens, but inside the courtroom, language felt inadequate, stripped down to its barest function, because there are moments when words can only point at something too large to hold. Sentencing came weeks later, another return to a place no one wanted to revisit, and prosecutors spoke of brutality, of betrayal, of a life stolen in a place meant to be safe, while the defense asked for mercy measured in years already lived, in age, in time past. Arguments that sounded hollow against the fact that the victim had been denied all of that. When the judge finally spoke, voice steady, unadorned, the sentence stretched long, designed to reach back across decades and finally anchor the crime in consequence, and as the gavel fell, the room absorbed the sound like a closing door. The man was led away slowly, escorted by officers half his age, and that image lingered, unsettling in its ordinariness, because this was not how people imagine monsters leaving the stage, and yet, reality rarely aligns with imagination. For the community, the verdict didn't end the story so much as shifted, from speculation to reflection, from fear of the unknown to the discomfort of knowing, and conversations turned inward, people asking themselves how they had missed it, how someone could live among them unnoticed. How many other stories like this were still waiting in boxes. In the days that followed, experts filled the airwaves, discussing forensic genealogy, database ethics, the expanding reach of DNA technology, praising its power while warning of its implications, and the case became a touchstone. Cited in conferences and classrooms as proof that the past is no longer as buried as it once was. Investigators involved in the case gave interviews, careful and measured, acknowledging the victory without celebration, because for them, solving a cold case is less about triumph and more about responsibility, a reminder that every unsolved file represents a promise deferred. Not a puzzle abandoned. But beneath the public discourse, quieter stories unfolded, the kind that never make headlines, a sibling finally sleeping through the night, a parent visiting a grave with new words to say, neighbors walking past the old house with a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. Because the street itself had carried the weight of that morning for decades, absorbing whispers and glances, and now, even with the case officially closed, the memory remained embedded in its walls. Questions persisted, because they always do, about motive, about that final encounter, about what exactly happened between the moment she turned on the radio and the moment everything stopped. And the truth is, some answers die with the people who hold them. The defendant never fully explained himself, offered no narrative that could make sense of the violence, and perhaps that absence was its own kind of honesty, an acknowledgement that not all acts fit neatly into stories we can understand or accept. The evidence was archived again, this time with finality, labeled solved, but the word felt imperfect, a technical term that failed to capture the emotional residue left behind, because solving a case doesn't erase its impact, it merely changes how it's carried. The cold case unit moved on to other files, other names, other boxes waiting patiently for science and persistence to catch up, and in that sense, the case became both an ending and a beginning, a reminder of what is possible and what remains unfinished. Years later, the story would be retold in documentaries and podcasts, the familiar beats replayed, the shock of the DNA match, the long-delayed arrest, the courtroom drama distilled into episodes, and with each retelling, the edges would shift slightly, emphasis changing with perspective. But the core would remain, a woman, a crime, a silence that stretched for decades before breaking. And with each retelling, a new audience would feel that same chill, that same unsettling realization that time does not necessarily protect the guilty, it merely postpones their reckoning. For the community, the case became part of its identity, a marker in time, before and after. And though new families arrived, new stories took root, the old one never fully left, passed down in conversations, in warnings, in the collective memory of a place that learned too early how fragile safety can be. The house eventually changed hands, renovated, repainted, its past disclosed in legal language that felt inadequate, but for those who knew, the knowledge lingered, invisible but present, a reminder etched into the geography of everyday life. And still, despite the verdict, despite the sentence, despite the headlines declaring resolution, an unease remained, because the case had revealed something deeper than a single crime. It had exposed the long shadow cast by unsolved violence, the way it warps time, stretches grief, and tests faith in systems built by humans and therefore imperfect. The California 1995 cold case was closed on paper, but in memory, it stayed open, a cautionary echo reminding everyone who listened that justice, when it comes late, arrives carrying not just answers, but the weight of all the years it took to find them. Long after the courthouse emptied and the microphones were packed away, the story refused to settle, because closure is a word that sounds decisive but behaves like a ghost. And in the months that followed the verdict, the town learned that solving a cold case doesn't quiet the noise. It rearranges it. Conversations shifted from who did it to how it happened, from fear of the unknown to the discomfort of recognition, and people began replaying their own memories of the 90s, searching for moments that now felt charged with missed meaning, a passing glance, a stranger at a stoplight, a night when the street felt a little too quiet. The investigators returned to their routines, but something about this case stayed with them, a low hum beneath newer files, because it had taught them patience in a way training never could, had shown them that evidence is not always loud, that sometimes the most important proof whispers until technology learns how to listen. Younger detectives asked questions, wanting to know what it felt like to reopen a case older than their careers, and the answers were never simple, because reopening the past means asking people to feel again what they've spent years trying to forget. The family tried to move forward, a phrase offered by well-meaning strangers that never quite fit, because you don't move forward from something like this, you move with it, adjusting your balance. Learning how to carry a truth that arrived too late to change the outcome but too powerfully to ignore. They spoke at advocacy events, urging the preservation of evidence, the funding of cold case units, their voices steady but weighted, knowing firsthand what happens when time and neglect conspire against justice. Their grief became a warning and a call, a reminder that behind every file number is a life paused mid-sentence. Media attention slowly faded. As it always does, stories cycling out to make room for the next shock, the next crisis, and yet, this case lingered in professional circles, cited whenever DNA technology was discussed, whenever ethical debates flared about privacy and genetic databases. Because it sat at the intersection of hope and unease. The same tools that had finally named a killer also raised questions about how much of ourselves we unknowingly leave behind, about the future implications of a science that can reach backward through time with such precision. In quiet moments, residents revisited the old timeline, now annotated with answers, and realized how close the truth had always been, how it had lived just beyond the limits of what was possible then. The suspect's proximity, his brief intersection with a victim's life, felt almost cruel in hindsight, a reminder that violence doesn't always come from distant darkness. Sometimes it emerges from the periphery, unnoticed until it's too late. That realization reshaped how people talked about safety, about intuition, about the thin line between routine and rupture. The house remained, a physical anchor for an invisible history, and those who lived nearby spoke of it with a careful respect, not fear exactly, but awareness, as if the walls themselves had learned something about patience. New owners repainted, replaced fixtures, filled rooms with new laughter, but the past lingered quietly, not as a threat, but as a presence, a reminder that spaces remember even when people try not to. Some nights, longtime neighbors still glanced toward it, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, a reflex formed when the story was still unfinished. For law enforcement, the case triggered audits, reviews of other unsolved files from the same era, evidence re-examined, boxes reopened, because success breeds momentum, and momentum, in the right hands, can become accountability. Not every case yielded answers, not every sample survived, but the effort itself marked a shift, a refusal to accept that time alone should decide which victims matter. Each reopened file carried the possibility of another reckoning, another family hearing a phone call that changes everything. The man convicted faded from public view, his name appearing occasionally in legal updates, appeals filed and denied, his life now defined by a single act that had defined someone else's absence for decades. He never offered a full explanation, never filled in the blanks that still haunted the case, and perhaps that silence was its own final cruelty, a refusal to grant understanding even as punishment was imposed. Psychologists speculated, commentators debated, but speculation never solidified into truth, leaving motive as the last unresolved element, a question mark that no verdict could erase. As years passed, the case settled into a strange duality, both solved and unsettled, a reminder that justice operates on a different clock than grief, that answers don't arrive at the same speed as pain. Students studied it as precedent, detectives referenced it as motivation, and families of other cold case victims clung to it as proof that waiting might one day end, that persistence and progress could converge in unexpected ways. Hope, fragile but stubborn, threaded its way through those conversations, tempered by the knowledge that not every story ends like this one. On anniversaries, the date still drew attention, quieter now, more reflective, articles focusing less on shock and more on legacy, on what the case had changed, on what it had revealed about the long reach of violence and the slow, uneven march toward accountability. The victim's name was spoken with intention, no longer just as a headline, but as a person reclaimed from anonymity, her life remembered not only for how it ended, but for the impact it had in forcing a system to evolve. And in the end, that may be the most unsettling truth of all, that progress so often comes at the cost of irreparable loss, that systems learn because someone was hurt badly enough to expose their limits. The California 1995 cold case closed a chapter in law enforcement history, but it also opened a deeper conversation about memory, technology, and the patience required to let truth surface on its own time. The story no longer belonged to mystery alone, nor to science, nor to the courtroom. It belonged to the space where all three collided, leaving behind a lesson written not in ink, but in years. Even now, When the fog rolls in on certain mornings, locals say the street feels heavier, quieter, as if it remembers what once unfolded there and what it took for the truth to finally emerge. The radio still plays, cars still cool in driveways, doors still open and close without incident, but beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, the echo remains, a low, persistent reminder that some stories don't end when they're solved. They simply change the way we listen for the next one. Years slipped by after the sentence, but the case never fully receded into the background, because some stories, once they surface, refuse to sink again, and this one had altered too many lives, reshaped too many assumptions, to ever become just another entry in an archive. Detectives who had cut their teeth on the investigation found themselves measuring every new case against it, asking what might be waiting quietly in evidence rooms, what truths were aging patiently in boxes no one had opened in decades, and that awareness changed the tempo of their work, slowed it, sharpened it, because they had learned the cost of overlooking what seems insignificant in the moment. Cold case units across the state began to mirror the process that had cracked 1995 open, funding requests justified with its name, presentations built around its timeline, its success wielded carefully, not as a miracle, but as proof of endurance, of what happens when persistence outlasts denial. Evidence custodians reviewed protocols, retrained staff, relabeled shelves, aware now that a single mislabeled envelope could delay justice for a generation. The past, once considered fixed, had become malleable again, and that realization carried both promise and pressure. For the family, life settled into a new rhythm that felt neither peaceful nor chaotic, but something in between, a steady coexistence with answers they had once begged for. Therapy sessions replaced court dates, anniversaries were marked with intention rather than dread, and while grief never loosened its grip, it shifted, no longer tethered to uncertainty, but to a truth that could be named. They spoke of the strange loneliness that followed the verdict, the way support fades once headlines do, leaving behind the quiet work of living with what remains. Justice, they learned, is loud when it arrives and silent afterward. The community changed subtly, not in ways you could chart on a map, but in posture, in vigilance, in the questions parents asked their children, in the way neighbors noticed unfamiliar cars, unfamiliar faces. Trust didn't disappear, but it became conditional, informed by the knowledge that danger doesn't always announce itself, that it can wear the mask of ordinariness for years. The case had stripped away a layer of innocence, replacing it with something harder, more cautious, but also more aware. Academic journals dissected the investigation, focusing on the forensic genealogy that had tipped the balance, the ethical lines navigated, the warrants drafted with surgical care to avoid contaminating a victory with controversy. Debates flared about consent, about the reach of genetic databases, about how much privacy a society should surrender in exchange for answers, and the 1995 case sat at the center of those arguments, a tangible example that complicated easy positions. For every voice praising the outcome, another warned of futures where surveillance outpaced safeguards, where the net cast to catch the guilty might also ensnare the innocent. Meanwhile, investigators quietly revisited the moments leading up to the crime one last time, not because they doubted the verdict, but because understanding mattered, because clarity has its own value beyond punishment. They reconstructed the likely sequence, the knock or the encounter, the sudden turn from normal to catastrophic, piecing it together from physical evidence, witness recollections, and behavioral analysis, and what emerged was less cinematic than unsettling. A reminder that violence often erupts from mundane interactions, from fleeting decisions made in seconds that ripple outward for decades. The absence of a clear motive continued to haunt the narrative, an empty space where meaning should have been, and psychologists weighed in, discussing impulse, opportunity, the possibility that the act itself was less about the victim than about access, vulnerability, timing. Those explanations offered frameworks but not comfort, because they reduced something deeply personal to variables and probabilities, and for those who had loved her, that reduction felt inadequate, even disrespectful. Some questions, they came to accept, are not meant to be resolved, only acknowledged. As technology advanced further, the case was occasionally invoked as a warning against complacency, a reminder that today's cutting edge will one day be obsolete, that evidence dismissed now may speak later in ways we cannot yet imagine. Training programs emphasized humility, urging investigators to preserve everything, to document meticulously, to resist the temptation to declare finality too early. The ghost of 1995 hovered over those lessons, a silent instructor reminding them that the future is always watching the past. The street where it happened grew older along with everyone else, trees taller, paint peeling and refreshed. Children who once played there now adults with memories shaped by stories they half understood at the time. They spoke of growing up with the case as background noise, a cautionary tale folded into adolescence, and how its resolution felt like closing a book they'd never finished reading, satisfying and unsettling all at once. The place itself had matured, carrying its history not as a scar, but as a layer, one among many that define a community over time. In law enforcement circles, the case became shorthand for delayed reckoning, invoked whenever someone asked whether it was worth reopening something old, something difficult. Is it worth it? They would say, and someone else would answer by naming the year, 1995, and the conversation would end there, because the answer had already been written in decades. Persistence, it turned out, wasn't just a virtue, it was a responsibility. And yet, despite all the analysis, the training, the progress, a quiet discomfort lingered, because the case had exposed not just the power of modern tools, but the fragility of timing, the idea that justice is often less about intent and more about when knowledge becomes possible. That discomfort followed investigators home, followed families into their daily routines, followed the community into its future. A reminder that certainty is often provisional, and that truth, when it finally arrives, carries with it the weight of all the years it remained just out of reach. What lingered most was not the verdict or the sentence, but the space around them, the silence that followed once the machinery of justice powered down, because silence has a way of revealing what noise conceals, and in that quiet, people began to notice the emotional aftershocks rippling outward. Subtle but persistent. Friends of the victim spoke of a strange guilt, the kind that blooms years later, wondering why they hadn't called more often, why they hadn't insisted she come over that night, questions that had no answers but demanded to be asked anyway. The solved case did not erase those private reckonings, it sharpened them. Detectives, too, carried their own versions of that weight, replaying early decisions with the benefit and burden of hindsight, scrutinizing reports written when they were younger, less experienced, less aware of how long consequences can stretch. They remembered the evidence as it once looked, incomplete, frustrating, and compared it to what it had become, decisive, damning, and the contrast was unsettling because it underscored how much justice depends on circumstance, on tools available, on the narrow margins between what is known and what is merely suspected. In training rooms and late-night conversations, they talked about luck, though few liked the word, because luck implies randomness, and this case felt anything but random, yet it was impossible to ignore how close the truth had come to disappearing entirely. How easily a mislabeled box or a discarded sample could have erased the possibility of resolution forever. That awareness bred a kind of reverence for procedure, a renewed respect for the unglamorous details that rarely make headlines but determine outcomes decades later. The victim's name began to appear in new contexts, scholarships established in her honor, local initiatives aimed at violence prevention, small acts of remembrance that shifted her legacy from tragedy to impact. These gestures didn't overwrite the loss, but they reframed it, giving the community a way to speak her name without always whispering it. For those who had known her, this transformation was bittersweet, a reminder that while her life had been cut short, its echo continued to shape the world she left behind. The man convicted became an abstraction again, his presence reduced to paperwork and occasional appeals, and this reduction raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of accountability, about whether a system can truly balance decades of freedom against years of confinement. Philosophers weighed in, commentators argued, but no argument could fully reconcile the asymmetry, the fact that time stolen can never be returned in equal measure. Justice, once again, revealed its limitations. As forensic technology continued to evolve, whispers of other potential matches surfaced in different cases, other names rising from obscurity as databases expanded, and each announcement sent a quiet tremor through communities still living with unanswered questions. The 1995 case became a benchmark, a reminder that waiting is not the same as forgetting, that patience, when paired with progress, can eventually force even the most stubborn secrets into the open. But it also served as a warning, because not every case would benefit from such convergence. Not every story would receive a late-breaking revelation. The family received letters from strangers, from people who had followed the case from afar, offering condolences, gratitude, sometimes confessions of their own unresolved grief tied to different crimes, and reading them became a ritual, a way of understanding how far the story had traveled beyond the borders of that street. In those letters, they saw reflected the universal hunger for answers, the shared fear that without them, loss feels uncontained, free to expand indefinitely. Community meetings address safety, trust, and the role of vigilance without paranoia, a delicate balance shaped by lived experience. Leaders spoke carefully, aware that fear can fracture as easily as it can protect, and the case was referenced not as a specter, but as a lesson, a reminder to look out for one another without surrendering to suspicion. This recalibration of collective mindset was slow, uneven, but real, a subtle evolution born from hard-earned knowledge. In quieter corners of the town, memories surfaced unbidden, triggered by the smell of coffee, the sound of a radio, mundane details that had become indelibly linked to the morning everything changed. These sensory echoes reminded people that trauma doesn't adhere to timelines, that it resurfaces when it chooses, indifferent to verdicts or anniversaries. Healing, they learned, is not linear. It loops, revisits, doubles back, demanding acknowledgement again and again. For the cold case unit, the story never truly ended because it informed every new file, every decision to reopen or set aside, every argument for resources in a world where attention is finite and suffering is not. They carried the case with them like a compass, not pointing north, but pointing toward persistence, toward the belief that even when answers feel impossibly distant, the act of continuing to look has value in itself. And beneath all of this, threading through personal reckonings and institutional change, was a quieter, more unsettling realization that the boundary between solved and unsolved is thinner than it appears. That certainty often rests on foundations laid by people who may never see the outcome of their work. The California 1995 cold case had crossed that boundary at last, but the journey revealed just how precarious the crossing can be and how many other stories remain poised on the edge, waiting for the right moment, the right tool, the right convergence of effort and time. With distance came perspective, and with perspective, an uneasy clarity about what the case had ultimately revealed, not just about one crime, but about the architecture of memory itself, how communities store trauma, how institutions archive failure alongside hope. The California 1995 cold case became less a singular event and more a lens, a way of examining how violence reverberates long after the scene is processed and the tape is taken down. People spoke about it in the past tense, but its influence operated firmly in the present. The victim's routine, once analyzed for clues, transformed into a symbol, cited in discussions about how predictability can be both comfort and vulnerability. Her final morning, dissected by investigators for years, took on an almost mythic quality, a sequence of ordinary actions imbued with extraordinary consequence, and this transformation raised uncomfortable questions about how easily any life can tip from normal to catastrophic. How thin the margin truly is. The case forced people to confront the randomness they prefer to believe exists only elsewhere. Institutions adapted in small but meaningful ways, grants earmarked for evidence preservation, policies updated to require periodic cold case reviews, a quiet acknowledgement that waiting for breakthroughs without preparation is a gamble too costly to take. Administrators referenced the case when budgets were challenged, arguing that investment now could prevent decades of uncertainty later, and while spreadsheets rarely capture grief, This time, the argument carried weight because the cost of delay had been made painfully visible. The science continued to evolve, databases growing denser, algorithms more precise, and with each advancement, the past seemed to lean closer, as if listening, ready to speak if given the chance. Ethicists urged restraint, lawmakers debated guardrails, and the public oscillated between awe and unease, aware that the same technology capable of resolving decades-old pain also carried the power to expose lives in ways no previous generation had faced. The 1995 case sat at the center of that tension, both proof of promise and a cautionary tale. For the family, the long arc of the story reframed their relationship with time, teaching them that healing does not correspond neatly with resolution, that knowing what happened does not undo the waiting, but it does change its shape. They spoke of the difference between unanswered grief and answered grief, subtle but profound, the former an open wound, the latter a scar that still aches when pressed. This distinction became part of how they explained their experience to others navigating similar loss. In classrooms, the case was taught not just as an example of forensic success, but as a study in perseverance and humility, instructors emphasizing how many hands had touched the evidence before it finally spoke, how many decisions, correct and flawed, had shaped its journey. Students were reminded that they, too, were laying groundwork for futures they might never witness, a sobering responsibility that reframed the allure of solving crimes as something deeper and more enduring. The street itself remained a touchstone, occasionally appearing in news segments revisiting the case, its ordinariness contrasting sharply with its history. Viewers commented on how unremarkable it looked, as if expecting visible scars, unaware that trauma rarely announces itself architecturally. For locals, the familiarity was grounding, a reminder that life continues in the very places where it once shattered, not in defiance of tragedy, but alongside it. As new cold cases surfaced in the media, comparisons were inevitable, and while some shared superficial similarities, none replicated the precise convergence of factors that had allowed this one to break open when it did. This realization tempered expectations, reminding advocates that patience must be paired with realism, that hope is essential but not predictive. The case had become a beacon, not a blueprint, illuminating possibilities without guaranteeing outcomes. In private moments, people who had followed the story from the beginning reflected on their own aging alongside the case, realizing how much of their lives had unfolded in the shadow of its unresolved question. Births, marriages, careers, losses, all had occurred while the answer lay dormant, and that awareness brought a strange intimacy, a sense of having shared time with a story even when it was silent. When the silence finally broke, it felt personal, as if something long suspended had at last been set down. The most enduring lesson, though rarely stated outright, was about listening, about the importance of attending to what seems small, insignificant, easily overlooked. The DNA beneath fingernails, the half-remembered sighting, the archived box on a forgotten shelf, all of it mattered, eventually, and the case became a testament to the idea that nothing preserved in good faith is ever truly wasted. Time may blur details, but it can also sharpen them, given the right conditions. And so the California 1995 cold case settled into its final form, not as a tidy conclusion, but as a layered narrative, part caution, part affirmation, its meaning continuing to evolve as new technologies and new generations reinterpret it. The story no longer demanded attention with urgency, but it commanded respect, a quiet authority earned through decades of silence and a belated, undeniable truth that reshaped how people thought about justice, memory, and the long, patient work of listening for answers. As the years stretched further from the verdict, the case began to occupy a different space in the collective mind, no longer raw, no longer headline-driven, but embedded, like a fault line everyone knew was there even if the ground felt steady again. It surfaced in unexpected moments, in conversations about trust, about technology, about the quiet assumptions people make to get through the day, and each time it did, it carried the same unsettling reminder that certainty is often an illusion maintained by habit rather than fact. The victim story became a reference point for those working in victim advocacy, a way to explain why persistence matters even when hope feels impractical. Advocates spoke of the long silence her family endured, not as a cautionary tale of failure, but as evidence of endurance, of what it takes to keep asking questions when the world has moved on. In these retellings, the focus shifted away from the perpetrator entirely, centering instead on the cost of waiting and the resilience required to survive it. Law enforcement agencies continued to mine their archives, inspired and haunted by what had been uncovered in 1995's Shadow, and with each reopened box came a mix of anticipation and dread, because answers, when they arrive, are never neutral. Some cases yielded clarity, others collapsed under the weight of time, evidence degraded, memories eroded, and investigators were forced to confront the limits of even the most advanced tools. The lesson was sobering. Technology can extend reach, but it cannot resurrect what has been lost entirely. The ethics debates intensified as genetic databases grew, voices rising on both sides, some arguing that solving violent crimes justified the intrusion, others warning of a future where anonymity becomes obsolete. Panels cited the case repeatedly, dissecting its safeguards, its warrants, its restraint, using it as an example of how power might be wielded responsibly, even as they acknowledged that restraint is not guaranteed by capability alone. The story thus lived on not just as history, but as precedent, shaping decisions far beyond the town where it began. For those who had lived through the original investigation, aging brought its own form of reckoning. Retired detectives spoke candidly in interviews, admitting to moments of doubt that had followed them into retirement, wondering whether they had missed something obvious, whether a different question, a different instinct, might have changed the course of events. The DNA match offered validation, but it did not erase regret, because regret, like grief, does not yield easily to evidence. The family's private rituals evolved, anniversaries marked not only by remembrance, but by intention, acts of kindness, donations, moments of stillness that honored a life beyond the crime. They spoke of learning to live with two truths at once, that justice had been served, and that nothing about that justice could make them whole again. Holding both truths required strength of a quieter kind, a discipline of acceptance that outsiders often underestimated. In the community, younger generations learned about the case secondhand, filtered through parents and teachers who framed it carefully, aware of the balance between awareness and fear. To them, the 90s felt distant, almost abstract, and the idea that a mystery could persist so long seemed implausible in an age of instant information. Yet the case served as a bridge between eras, a reminder that even in a hyper-connected world, some answers still take time, patience, and the willingness to look backward as well as forward. The house itself continued to stand, unremarkable, occasionally photographed by those retracing the story, its existence a quiet rebuke to the idea that places absorb guilt or absolution. It bore witness, without commentary, a constant amid shifting interpretations, and for those who passed it daily, it became less a symbol of violence and more a marker of survival, proof that life does not stop where tragedy begins. Professionally, the case influenced policy in ways that were never dramatic but deeply consequential: standardized evidence retention laws, cross-agency collaboration protocols, funding models that recognized the long horizon of justice. These changes rarely bore her name publicly, but they carried her legacy nonetheless, embedded in systems designed to prevent other families from waiting as long as hers had. Impact, it turned out, does not always announce itself. And beneath all these developments ran a current of humility, an acknowledgement that the line between known and unknown is thinner than anyone likes to admit. The California 1995 cold case had crossed that line at last, but in doing so, it revealed how much depends on chance, on preservation, on the persistence of people willing to keep asking questions long after the answers seem gone. That realization stayed with everyone touched by the case, a quiet companion to progress, reminding them that justice is not a destination, but a process measured not only in outcomes, but in the willingness to endure uncertainty without surrendering to it. Time softened the edges, but never erased the outline, and as another decade approached since the verdict, the case took on the quality of a long echo, quieter now, but still shaping the way people thought about violence, accountability, and the patience required to hold space for truth. It no longer dominated conversation, yet it surfaced reliably whenever someone asked how long justice can take before it loses meaning, and the answer, though rarely spoken plainly, lived in the span between 1995 and the moment DNA finally spoke. For those who had worked the case, retirement brought reflection unfiltered by urgency, a chance to revisit decisions without the pressure of outcomes. Some admitted they had once believed the case would never be solved, that it would remain a footnote in departmental history, cited only as an example of frustration. The fact that it hadn't ended that way reshaped how they viewed uncertainty, not as failure, but as an interval, a stretch of time during which answers are simply not yet ready to emerge. The evolution of forensic science continued at a pace that felt both exhilarating and unnerving, each advancement widening the gap between what had once been unknowable and what now seemed inevitable. Researchers reference the case when discussing latent potential, the idea that evidence carries future value independent of present capability. This notion altered how crime scenes were processed, how samples were stored, how restraint was practiced in declaring conclusions, because the lesson had been learned at high cost. Today's silence does not predict tomorrow's truth. Public memory of the case shifted again as new stories crowded the news cycle, tragedies unfolding with faster resolutions, clearer narratives, and the contrast was stark. People began to ask whether modern cases would ever become cold in the same way, whether technology had finally outrun mystery. Experts cautioned against such certainty, pointing out that complexity evolves alongside capability, that new tools bring new blind spots, and the 1995 case was often invoked as proof that confidence is most dangerous when it feels justified. The family's relationship with the story continued to evolve, less defined by the need to explain and more by the choice of when to remember. They spoke less frequently to the media, guarding their privacy, allowing the case to exist without constant narration. In doing so, they reclaimed something that had been taken early on, control over how and when their grief entered the public sphere, a quiet victory that mattered more to them than any headline ever had. Community institutions marked the case indirectly, incorporating its lessons into training programs, neighborhood initiatives, and public discussions about safety that emphasized connection over fear. The goal was not to memorialize violence, but to acknowledge vulnerability without surrendering to it, a balance shaped by decades of lived experience. The case became a reference point, not a warning shouted, but a fact understood, woven into the town's sense of itself. In academic circles, the case sparked longitudinal studies examining the psychological impact of long unsolved crimes, revealing patterns of chronic stress, suspended grief, and delayed healing that challenged traditional models of trauma. These findings influenced how support services were offered to families of cold case victims, emphasizing long-term care rather than crisis response alone. The story thus continued to generate change, quietly extending its reach into places far removed from the original crime scene. The convicted man aged in custody, appeals exhausted, his name gradually fading from public consciousness, and this fading raised its own questions about memory and accountability. Society, it seemed, was more comfortable remembering the mystery than the perpetrator, more inclined to preserve the narrative of waiting than the reality of punishment. This imbalance felt appropriate to some, unsettling to others, but it underscored a truth about storytelling, that absence often leaves a deeper imprint than presence. As anniversaries passed, they became less about counting years and more about measuring distance, how far the community had come from the morning when everything fractured, how much had changed, how much remained stubbornly the same. The street looked different, the people older, the systems more advanced, yet the fundamental vulnerability that made the crime possible still existed, a reminder that progress does not confer immunity. And through it all, the case maintained a quiet authority, a reminder that some truths demand patience measured not in days or months, but in lifetimes. The California 1995 cold case no longer needed to shock to be heard. Its power lay in its endurance, in the way it continued to inform decisions long after the gavel fell. It stood as proof that justice, when it finally arrives, does not close a door so much as open a longer conversation, one that stretches forward as insistently as the silence once stretched back. In the end, what remained was not the spectacle of resolution but the residue of time, the way decades had settled into the case like dust into corners no one thinks to clean, shaping everything it touched. The California 1995 cold case no longer needed explanation, its outline familiar enough that a single reference could summon the whole history: the open door, the quiet kitchen, the years of not knowing, the sudden shock of knowing too much all at once. It had become a shared memory, even for those who arrived long after the crime itself, a reminder that some stories imprint themselves on a place and refuse to fade politely. For the community, the final lesson was not about fear but about attention, about noticing the ordinary without surrendering to paranoia, about understanding that safety is not a permanent state, but a practice renewed daily. People spoke of the case less often now, but when they did, it was with a measured tone, stripped of sensationalism, focused instead on what had been learned and what still demanded care. The story had matured, shedding its urgency while retaining its gravity, a transformation that mirrored the community's own aging. The victim's life, once defined publicly by its violent end, gradually reclaimed its fullness in private memory, stories shared among friends and family that had nothing to do with the case file, laughter, quirks, moments that never appeared in evidence logs. This reclaiming mattered because it pushed back against the tendency to let tragedy eclipse everything else, asserting that a life is more than the circumstances of its loss. In that sense, the final chapter of the story belonged not to courts or laboratories, but to those who remembered her as she lived. For investigators and students of justice, the case settled into a kind of quiet reverence, cited sparingly, thoughtfully, aware that its power lay not in drama but in duration. It reminded them that truth is not always accessible on demand, that answers may depend on futures we cannot yet imagine, and that the responsibility of the present is to preserve the past with enough care that it can one day speak. This understanding reshaped priorities, shifting focus from quick wins to long horizons, from closure to stewardship. The technology that had unlocked the case continued to advance, but with each new capability came a deeper awareness of restraint, a recognition that power without deliberation risks becoming another form of injustice. The 1995 case was often invoked here, not as justification for unchecked reach, but as evidence that patience and precision can coexist, that it is possible to pursue truth without abandoning principle. Its legacy in this context was one of balance, reminder that how we find answers matters as much as the answers themselves. The house on the street remained, as it always had, part of the landscape, neither memorial nor monument, just a place where life continued. For newcomers, it was unremarkable, another address among many, and for long-time residents, that ordinariness was its own kind of healing. The absence of spectacle allowed the space to breathe again, to exist without constant reference to what had happened there, proving that places, like people, can carry history without being defined by it. Occasionally, a documentary or article would revisit the case, drawing new audiences into its orbit, and with each retelling, the emphasis shifted slightly, reflecting the concerns of the moment: technology 1 year, ethics the next, grief another. This evolution kept the story alive without freezing it, allowing it to function as a living reference rather than a static artifact. The cold case, once a symbol of stagnation, had become an example of movement, slow, uneven, but undeniable. For families still waiting on answers in other cases, the story remained a complicated beacon, inspiring without promising too much. Advocates were careful to frame it honestly, acknowledging the rarity of such resolutions while emphasizing the importance of persistence, preservation, and hope tempered by realism. The message was not that every case will be solved, but that every case deserves to be remembered as if it might be, because forgetting is the only outcome that guarantees silence. As the people connected to the case aged, their memories intertwined with it, milestones measured against its timeline, and there was a quiet recognition that they had lived alongside an unanswered question for much of their lives. When the answer finally arrived, it did not rewrite those years, but it did alter how they were understood, turning waiting into witness, uncertainty into context. This reframing did not erase pain, but it gave it shape, making it something that could be carried rather than endlessly endured. The California 1995 cold case, once defined by what it lacked, ended defined by what it revealed about patience, about progress, about the cost of delay, and the value of care. Its conclusion did not deliver peace so much as perspective, an understanding that justice is not a moment but a continuum, influenced by choices made long before and long after any single crime. This understanding lingered, subtle but persistent, shaping how people approach the future with a little more humility than before. And so the story finally settled, not into silence, but into something quieter and more enduring, a low, steady presence beneath the noise of new headlines and new crises. It remained as a reminder that time does not erase truth. It tests our willingness to wait for it, and that even when answers arrive late, they still matter, not because they undo the past, but because they honor it. In that way, the cold case never truly ended. It simply changed its role, from an open wound to a scar, visible enough to remember, healed enough to live with, and permanent enough to ensure that what happened in 1995 would never disappear into the dark again. Even after everything had been said, recorded, archived, and analyzed, the case kept breathing in small, almost imperceptible ways, like an ember that refuses to go cold, and those who thought the story had finally reached its natural end slowly realized that some narratives don't conclude. They disperse. The California 1995 cold case had done exactly that, scattering fragments of itself into policies, conversations, instincts, and quiet moments of reflection that surfaced without warning. It lived on not as a question anymore, but as a presence. In law enforcement academies, recruits heard it mentioned not with reverence, but with caution, instructors lowering their voices slightly when they reached that part of the lecture, emphasizing that time is neither ally nor enemy, only a condition, and that how one works within it matters more than speed. The case became shorthand for humility, a reminder that certainty should be provisional, that every conclusion carries an asterisk written by the future. No one framed it as a miracle. Miracles excuse complacency. This was framed as work, slow, patient, and relentlessly human. Families of other unsolved cases continued to reach out, quietly at first, then with more confidence, asking not for guarantees, but for understanding, for someone to acknowledge that waiting itself is a form of trauma. Counselors and advocates, informed by what this case had revealed, adjusted how they spoke to them. Less emphasis on closure, more on endurance, on the reality that hope does not always look like optimism. Sometimes it looks like stubbornness, like refusing to let a name fade from conversation. The 1995 case offered language for that kind of hope, restrained but persistent. The technology that had unlocked the truth continued to sharpen, but so did the warnings around it. New legislation drafted with careful phrasing, oversight committees formed to ensure that power did not outpace principle. In these rooms, the case was referenced again, not as justification for expansion, but as evidence that restraint had worked, that it was possible to reach backward without flattening the present. The balance was delicate, and everyone knew it, because once that balance tips, trust erodes quickly, and trust, like time, is hard to recover once lost. The victim's story found its way into quieter places, personal notebooks, classroom discussions, moments of silence at community events where her name was spoken without explanation, because explanation was no longer necessary. She became part of the town's internal vocabulary, a shared understanding rather than a public spectacle. This shift mattered because it marked the moment when the story stopped belonging to the media cycle and returned to the people who had carried it longest. For those who had grown up alongside the case, now adults themselves, its resolution reframed their own memories, childhood fears that suddenly made sense, conversations overheard but never fully understood. Some spoke of a strange gratitude mixed with sorrow, grateful to have lived to see an answer, sorrowful that it had taken so long. The case taught them something about patience they would later recognize in unexpected parts of their lives, about the difference between urgency and importance, and how easily the two are confused. The perpetrator's silence endured, and with time, it became less a provocation and more a fact, another reminder that not every story yields a confession, not every crime provides narrative symmetry. Criminologists wrote about this absence, arguing that the need for motive is often a reflection of our own discomfort rather than an investigative necessity. The case demonstrated that accountability does not require understanding, that justice does not depend on explanation, only on truth sufficiently supported to stand. As years continued to pass, the case slipped further into history, but not into obscurity, occupying a stable place where it could be referenced without reopening wounds. That stability was hard-won, achieved not through forgetting, but through repetition, the story told often enough, carefully enough, that it lost its sharpest edges without losing its meaning. In that way, it mirrored grief itself, which softens not by disappearing, but by being integrated. Occasionally, someone new would arrive in town and hear the story for the first time, reacting with a shock that long-term residents no longer felt, and that reaction served as a quiet reminder of how extraordinary the case truly was. The locals listened, nodded, and filled in the details with practiced restraint, aware now of the responsibility that comes with telling a story shaped by real loss. They had learned that how you tell it matters, that tone can either honor or exploit, and they chose honor. The final truth of the California 1995 cold case was not that science saved the day, or that justice eventually prevailed, though both were true in their own limited ways. The deeper truth was more uncomfortable, that resolution is never clean, that answers arrive carrying the weight of their delay, and that living with that weight is part of what it means to be human. The case did not restore balance so much as redefine it, reminding everyone involved that the past is never truly past. It waits, it watches, and sometimes, when the conditions are right, it speaks. And when it does not shout. It does not demand celebration. It simply asks to be acknowledged, to be held carefully, and to be carried forward with the understanding that every preserved detail, every unanswered question, every quiet act of persistence might one day matter more than anyone can currently imagine. That was the final echo of the case, not a conclusion, but an obligation, one that extended beyond 1995, beyond the courtroom, beyond the town itself, settling instead into the collective conscience as a reminder that time tests truth, but it does not erase it. By the time the case reached this stage in its afterlife, it no longer announced itself as a crime story at all, but as a quiet pressure shaping how people thought, how they paused, how they remembered. The California 1995 cold case had slipped into the background hum of experience, not loud enough to dominate, not faint enough to forget, and that hum carried a warning that never quite resolved into words. It reminded those who listened that certainty is temporary, that answers are conditional, and that the distance between ordinary and catastrophic can be measured in seconds. In interviews years later, people struggled to articulate what the case had changed, because change, when it's real, rarely arrives with a clear before and after. They spoke instead of instincts, of trusting discomfort a little more, of documenting details a little more carefully, of listening when something felt unfinished. These weren't dramatic shifts, but accumulative ones, the kind that reshape systems and cultures slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize the ground beneath you is no longer quite the same. The story began to appear less in true crime spaces and more in discussions about time itself, about what it means to wait, about how societies decide which wounds are allowed to remain open. Scholars wrote about temporal justice, the ethics of delay, the moral responsibility owed to the past, and though they rarely centered the case explicitly, its shadow was there, informing the questions they asked. The crime had become a reference point not for violence, but for endurance, a case study in how long truth can survive without error. Families still living with unanswered cases listened carefully when the story was mentioned, hearing not a promise, but a posture, The idea that waiting is not passive, that remembering is an act, that preserving evidence and insisting on relevance is a way of resisting erasure. For some, the case offered comfort. For others, it sharpened the pain. Both reactions were valid, and both underscored the same reality, that hope, when stretched over decades, changes its shape, becoming less about expectation and more about refusal. Institutions learn to speak more cautiously about closure, recognizing that the word implies a finality that reality rarely provides. Instead, they spoke of resolution where possible, accountability where earned, and care where neither could be achieved. This shift in language mattered, because language shapes expectation, and expectation, when mismanaged, can become another form of harm. The 1995 case had exposed this quietly, forcing systems to reckon not just with outcomes, but with how those outcomes are framed. The victim's presence persisted in subtle ways, not as a symbol, but as a person whose absence had rearranged lives. Friends aged into versions of themselves that had never known her beyond memory, and yet, her influence threaded through their stories, in choices made, in paths taken, in the way loss can quietly guide a life without ever announcing itself. This continuity felt truer than any headline because it honored the reality that people do not vanish when stories end. Even the investigators, long removed from the urgency of the case, found themselves returning to it in moments of doubt, not to relive success, but to remember restraint, to recall how easily conclusions harden too early, how patience can feel indistinguishable from failure until suddenly it isn't. The case had taught them that waiting is not empty time, that it is filled with unseen preparation, with systems evolving, with future hands learning how to listen better than past ones could. As new crimes came and went, some solved quickly, others slipping into silence, the 1995 case resisted comparison, not because it was unique, but because it had come to represent a truth people were reluctant to face, that justice is uneven not because it lacks intent, but because it is bound by human limits. Acknowledging that truth required humility, and humility is not a quality systems adopt easily. Yet here it was, embedded in the narrative, unavoidable. In the quietest sense, the case also altered how people understood responsibility across generations, the idea that actions taken today, careful documentation, ethical restraint, patient preservation, are not just procedural necessities, but gifts to the future. Gifts given without knowing who will receive them or when. The detectives of 1995 could not have imagined the tools that would one day interpret their work, but their choice to preserve made interpretation possible. That realization reframed legacy not as recognition, but as continuity. And so the story continued, not forward, not backward, but outward, diffusing into disciplines, into conversations, into habits of thought that would outlast any formal retelling. The California 1995 cold case no longer needed to be told from beginning to end to exert its influence. Its meaning had escaped linear narrative, becoming something more atmospheric, more persistent, a reminder carried in the background of decisions made long after the names and dates had blurred. In that sense, the case achieved a strange permanence, not frozen in time, but integrated into it, a reminder that some truths do not arrive to conclude a story, but to deepen it. And long after the last document was filed, long after the last appeal denied, long after the last anniversary passed quietly, the case continued to ask the same question it always had, not who did this, not how it happened, but what are we willing to preserve, to remember, to wait for? Knowing that the answer may come too late to change the past, but just in time to shape the future. By this point, the case existed less as a sequence of events and more as a state of mind, a reference people carried without consciously naming it, influencing how they interpreted uncertainty, how they reacted when answers failed to arrive on schedule. The California 1995 cold case had become a lesson absorbed rather than recited, its meaning distilled into a quiet awareness that the absence of resolution does not equal the absence of truth. Sometimes it only means the truth is waiting for a language it has not yet been given. In conversations about progress, someone would eventually mention it, not as proof that everything works, but as evidence that endurance matters, that systems bend not because they are flawless, but because enough people refuse to let them harden completely. That refusal, more than any single breakthrough, was what sustained the case across decades, carried forward by individuals who never expected recognition, only the possibility that their patience might one day matter. The story also reshaped how people understood responsibility, not as a single decisive act, but as a chain of small, often invisible choices, labeling a box correctly, preserving a sample instead of discarding it, writing a report with care even when no one seems to be listening. These choices rarely feel heroic in the moment, but the case revealed their cumulative power, how they can outlast careers, outlive assumptions, and eventually outmaneuver silence itself. For the family, the later years brought a quieter form of clarity, not peace, but steadiness, the ability to hold the story without being consumed by it. They spoke less about the crime and more about time, about how waiting had changed them, sharpened some edges, softened others. They learned that memory is not a static archive, but a living thing, reshaped by context, by knowledge, by the slow work of integrating loss into a life that must continue. The community, too, found itself living differently with the knowledge it now possessed, less reactive, more reflective. The case had taught them that fear thrives in the unknown, but certainty brings its own burden, a reckoning with proximity, with the uncomfortable fact that danger is not always distant or obvious. This awareness did not paralyze them, it matured them, replacing naivete with vigilance tempered by compassion. In professional circles, the case continued to surface as a reminder that success stories are rarely clean, that behind every solved file is a long trail of uncertainty, doubt, and near abandonment. It challenged the myth of linear progress, showing instead that advancement often moves in loops, revisiting old ground with new tools, reinterpreting what was once dismissed. This reframing encouraged a culture less obsessed with immediacy and more invested in sustainability. The language around cold cases evolved alongside it, shifting away from resignation and towards stewardship, an acknowledgement that unsolved does not mean finished, that waiting can be active, intentional, and ethical. The 1995 case became part of that linguistic shift, its history reminding people that words shape posture and posture shapes persistence. As new generations entered fields touched by the story, law, science, advocacy, they encountered it not as legend, but as context, something assumed rather than explained. This normalization carried its own significance, because it meant the lessons had been absorbed deeply enough to become background knowledge, informing decisions without needing constant reinforcement. The case had moved from anomaly to reference, from exception to example. And yet, despite all this integration, a trace of unease remained, because the case had revealed something fundamentally destabilizing, that time, often imagined as an eraser, is just as capable of preservation. It had shown that the past does not fade politely, that it lingers in materials, in systems, in people, waiting for alignment. This realization unsettled easy narratives about closure, forcing a more honest engagement with how justice actually unfolds. The California 1995 cold case no longer demanded attention, but it commanded care, a quiet insistence that what is set aside is never truly gone, that what is preserved with intention can outlast neglect, ignorance, even disbelief. Its endurance became its message, one not delivered with urgency, but with weight. And so the story continued its slow drift into permanence, not as a closed chapter, but as a margin note written across multiple disciplines, a reminder that answers are not always found by looking harder, but by waiting longer, listening better, and resisting the temptation to declare silence final. In that way, the case did not end with resolution or even with understanding, but with responsibility, passed forward, deliberately and without fanfare, to whoever would one day inherit the task of listening for truths that have not yet learned how to speak. By the 15th turn of the story, the case had shed nearly everything that once made it feel urgent, and what remained was something denser, heavier, harder to name, a kind of moral sediment left behind after decades of waiting, watching, and finally knowing. The California 1995 cold case no longer needed context or recap. It functioned